I'm obese, but I will give you sons, declared the desperate widow to the virgin mountain man. That's how it begins. On a snow-covered ridge where no one dares knock, she comes with nothing but a child, not her own, and a heart full of faith. He says nothing, just closes the door. But the next morning, bread appears. And so does a question no one dares ask. He's a man with ghosts in his hands. She's a woman with no more chances left. And the land they stand on? It holds a secret that could change everything. When spring comes and the past knocks louder than she ever did, what will this mountain man choose to protect? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The bitter March wind cut through the pines like a knife, whipping snow into Martha May's face as she urged her mule up the narrow mountain trail. Her fingers, stiff with cold inside worn leather gloves, gripped the lead rope of the loaded sled. Behind her, 10-year-old Casca huddled beneath layers of quilts, his small form barely visible. The climb seemed endless. Each step brought them closer to Elijah Storm's cabin, and with every step, Martha's heart pounded harder. Not from the effort, though her broad frame struggled against the steep grade, but from the weight of what she meant to do. When the cabin finally came into view, its log walls dark against the white landscape, Martha paused to catch her breath. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of pine. Her few possessions rattled in the sled: cooking pots, medicine bags, her mother's Bible wrapped in oilcloth, everything she owned in the world. "Stay here with Thunder," she told Casca, patting the mule's frost-covered neck. The boy nodded, his dark eyes solemn beneath the wool cap she'd knitted him. Martha's legs trembled as she made her way to the cabin door, not from the cold this time, but from fear. She'd heard the whispers about Elijah Storm, how he hadn't spoken more than 10 words together since the fire that took his family, how he'd abandoned his blacksmith trade to live alone in these heights, shunning all company. But she was out of options, out of time. Her knock echoed in the winter silence. For a long moment, nothing stirred inside. Then came the sound of heavy boots on wooden floors. The door swung open. Elijah Storm filled the frame, tall as a pine, and just as unbending. His beard was shot through with gray, his eyes the color of winter sky. They fixed on her face without expression. Martha's carefully prepared speech deserted her. The words that came out instead were raw, desperate. "I'm obese, but I will give you sons." She saw the shock register in his eyes, though his face remained still as stone. His gaze moved past her to where Casca waited with the sled, then back to her face. Without a word, he stepped back and closed the door. The sound was soft, final as a coffin lid. Martha stood there, tears freezing on her cheeks. The wind howled through the trees, mocking her foolishness. What had she expected? That this mountain hermit would welcome a heavy-set half-breed widow and an orphaned Indian boy with open arms? But she had nowhere else to go. The mining company had seized her tiny homestead, claiming an old survey mark gave them rights to the creek. They'd given her one day to clear out. Swallowing her pride, Martha returned to the sled. "We'll shelter in the barn tonight," she told Casca, forcing brightness into her voice. "It'll be an adventure." The lean-to barn stood apart from the cabin, its rough boards offering some protection from the wind. Martha spread their blankets on a bed of old hay, wrapped Casca in the thickest quilts, and held him close as darkness fell. The boy hadn't spoken since she'd found him half frozen in the snow 3 months ago, but his small hand found hers in the dark. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the howling wind and the mule's soft nickering. Near dawn, Martha woke to find something different. A thick buffalo hide had been draped over Casca while they slept, and on a nearby stump sat a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven. A jar of preserved lard. Not much, but in these mountains, such offerings meant everything. Movement caught her eye. Through the barn's gaps, she glimpsed Elijah Storm watching from the tree line, a dark figure against the snow. As she straightened, he turned and vanished into the forest without a sound. Martha stared after him, hope flickering in her chest like a candle flame. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a final no either. Maybe, just maybe, it was a chance. She waited until Casca stirred, then shared the bread with him. Afterward, she pulled on her gloves and stepped out into the pale morning light. The snow around the cabin needed clearing. The woodpile looked low. There was work to be done. And Martha May Killian had never been one to sit idle while waiting for an answer. She hefted the axe from their sled, testing its weight. The sound of her chopping echoed through the trees, each stroke a declaration. They would stay. They would work. They would prove their worth, even if it took all winter. And somewhere in the forest, Elijah Storm listened to the rhythm of her determination. Martha stirred the thin stew with a wooden spoon, watching the meager vegetables swirl in the broth. The fire she'd built near the barn cast dancing shadows on Casca's face as he huddled close, wrapped in the buffalo hide. Her back ached from the day's work, clearing snow, chopping wood, proving their worth with every swing of the axe. The mountain night pressed in around them, stars pricking through the black sky like pinpricks in velvet. She hadn't seen Elijah since morning, but signs of his presence appeared throughout the day like mysterious gifts. A kettle of clean spring water left by the barn door, a neat stack of kindling arranged just so. "Soup's ready," she told Casca, ladling the steaming liquid into their tin cups. The boy accepted his portion with a small nod, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Martha watched him sip carefully, remembering how she'd found him 3 months ago half frozen in the snow. Now here they were, camping in another man's barn, hanging their hopes on silent gestures of mercy. 2 more days passed in similar fashion. Martha worked from sunup to sundown, determined to show their value. She cleared paths through the snow, organized the woodpile, and swept the barn until the rough planks gleamed. Elijah remained a shadow at the edge of their vision, appearing and disappearing like a mountain ghost. On the 3rd morning, as Martha hauled water from the spring, she looked up to find Elijah standing in her path. Her heart jumped, but she held steady, meeting his winter gray eyes. He didn't speak, she hadn't expected him to, but his chin dipped in a single nod, his arm extended, pointing toward the back shed. Martha's throat tightened with emotion. It wasn't much, that rough-hewn shed, but it was shelter. It was permission. It was hope. She spent the rest of the day transforming the space, hanging scraps of cloth over the windows, sweeping years of dust from the corners. Her dried herbs, carefully preserved through their journey, soon dangled from the rafters, mint for tea, yarrow for fever, sage for blessing. The familiar scents helped mask the mustiness, making the shed feel more like home. "Time to get cleaned up," she told Casca that evening, helping him wash his face in the spring water. "We're going to town for church supper." The boy's eyes widened with uncertainty, but he didn't resist as she straightened his collar and smoothed his dark hair. Martha knew what awaited them in town: the stares, the whispers, the judgment. But she'd learned long ago that hiding only gave power to shame. The little church glowed with lamplight as they approached, hands clasped tight. Inside, the warmth of bodies and cooking smells wrapped around them. Conversation dimmed as heads turned, and Martha heard the whispers begin. "That's Martha May Killian. What's she doing up on Elijah Storm's land? Did you hear what happened to her place?" But before the murmurs could grow, Pastor Alden Riggs' gentle voice cut through. "Martha May, what a blessing to see you and young Casca tonight." His gray beard crinkled with his smile as he gestured to an empty spot at the table. "I believe Sister Jensen's brought her famous apple cake." The pastor's welcome seemed to break a spell. Other voices joined in, offering plates and conversation. Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness of it. After the meal, while Casca helped clear dishes, Pastor Rigg drew Martha aside. His kind eyes held something like hope as he spoke softly. "You know, Martha, there's something about Elijah few remember nowadays. Before the fire, he was known for his cradles as much as his ironwork. Made two of the finest I've ever seen, carved with leaves and vines, strong enough to last generations." He paused, watching her face. "Never gave them away, though. They're still up there somewhere, waiting for the right babies to rock." Martha's heart squeezed at the image. Elijah's large hands crafting such delicate things, pouring love into wood and iron before grief sealed his heart away. That night, after settling Casca in their new shelter, Martha sat by lamplight and carefully copied out words that had been running through her mind all evening. Her handwriting wasn't fancy, but it was clear as she wrote the psalm, "The Lord setteth the solitary in families." She left the paper folded on Elijah's swept porch, a gentle reminder that even the loneliest souls might find their way back to belonging. The days lengthened as March gave way to April, and the mountain snows began their slow retreat. Each morning, Martha rose before dawn to kindle her fire and brew a special drink. Sometimes coffee stretched with chicory, sometimes tea made from pine needles and dried mint. Steam rising from the tin mug, she'd place it carefully by Elijah's door, then hurry back to the shed before he emerged. He never spoke of these offerings, never acknowledged them with more than the faintest nod when their paths crossed. But each evening, Martha would find the mugs emptied and rinsed, set neatly on the stump where he'd first left them bred. They developed a language of actions, speaking through tasks completed and kindnesses offered. When Martha noticed the henhouse roof sagging under the weight of melting snow, she spent a morning patching it with spare boards and pitch. That afternoon, she returned from gathering firewood to find her modest pile had doubled in size, the logs split and stacked with precise care. The wilderness around them slowly wakened. Patches of bare earth appeared between drifts, and the first brave shoots pushed through the mud. Martha planted her herb garden in these thawed spaces, marking each row with string and wooden stakes. Sometimes she caught Elijah watching from the tree line as she worked, his tall frame as still as the pines behind him. One crisp morning, as Martha hung washing on the line, she heard something that made her pause. Casca sat in his usual spot by the shed, scratching pictures in the dirt with a stick. But this time he was humming, a low, gentle tune she'd never heard before. The melody tugged at her heart with its simple beauty. That evening, as she stirred their supper over the fire pit, she asked him, "That song you were humming today, where did you learn it?" Casca looked up from his drawing, charcoal smudged on his fingers. "Elijah sings it sometimes, when he thinks no one's listening, in the woods." Martha's hands stilled on the spoon. She hadn't known Elijah sang at all. The thought of him carrying music in his heart, even in solitude, filled her with unexpected warmth. As if summoned by their talk, a shadow fell across the fire. Elijah stood at the edge of the firelight, more present than he'd been since their arrival. Instead of retreating as he usually did, he lowered himself onto a log, his movements careful and deliberate. The three of them sat in silence as the sky deepened to purple. Martha served up bowls of bean soup, setting one near Elijah without comment. He accepted it with a slight inclination of his head. After a while, Casca began to speak, his voice soft as owl wings. He told them about his dreams, how his family came to visit him while he slept, especially his grandfather. How they walked together through summer meadows he remembered from before, gathering medicine plants and telling stories. How sometimes he woke up with tears on his face, but they weren't always sad tears. Martha watched Elijah as the boy spoke. The big man's face remained still, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that made her own throat tight. He knew about dreams of the lost, about waking to wet cheeks in the dark. The fire burned low, sparks rising to join the stars. When Casca's words finally ran dry, Elijah stood, his shadow stretching long across the ground. But before he turned away, he spoke, his voice rough with disuse but clear. "Don't expect nothing beyond safety here, Ms. Killian." He stared into the dying flames, not meeting her eyes. I ain't got it in me to be a husband. That part of me burned away long ago. Martha absorbed his words, feeling their weight but not their sting. She'd known from the start this wasn't about romance or traditional marriage. This was about something older, something that grew from shared silence and small mercies. "We're already a kind of family," she said simply, stirring the coals. "You just ain't used to it yet." Elijah's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't argue. Perhaps he recognized the truth in her words, how they'd begun to orbit each other like planets around a sun, connected by invisible bonds of routine and necessity. How Casca's presence had created a bridge between their separate solitudes. He walked away without another word, but his steps were slower than usual, as if he carried her words with him into the darkness. Martha watched him go, then turned to bank the fire for the night. Tomorrow she would leave another mug of hot drink by his door. Tomorrow he would empty it and rinse it clean. Small steps, small kindnesses, but sometimes that was how the greatest distances were crossed. Spring brought its own dangers to the mountains. Melting snow turned the narrow trails into ribbons of mud, and every creek ran high with icy runoff. One morning, after 3 days of steady rain, Elijah appeared at Martha's shed door just after sunrise. "Fences need checking," he said, gesturing toward the southern pasture. "Ground's too soft. Might be problems?" Martha nodded, already reaching for her shawl. "I'll help." Elijah's expression shifted slightly. "Trail's treacherous." "All the more reason to have 2 sets of eyes," Martha replied firmly. She'd noticed how he'd been favoring his right shoulder lately, though he never complained. He didn't argue further, just led her to where 2 horses stood saddled, his own sturdy bay and a gentle-eyed mule for her. Martha approached the animal with determination, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the saddle horn. It had been years since she'd ridden, and her size made mounting awkward. Elijah watched her struggle for a moment, then stepped forward. "Here," he said quietly, offering his cupped hands as a step. Martha hesitated only briefly before accepting his help, trying to ignore the warmth that crept up her neck as his strong hands steadied her. They rode in companionable silence, Martha concentrating on keeping her seat as the mule picked its way carefully along the muddy path. The morning air was sharp, with pine and wet earth, and new green growth pushed through the remaining patches of snow. At the edge of the southern field, Elijah reined in his horse. Martha drew alongside him, following his gaze across the pasture. The spring thaw had transformed the once firm ground into a patchwork of mud and standing water. Gopher holes dotted the field like pockmarks, making it dangerous for livestock. "This land," Elijah said suddenly, his voice low and rough with memory, "belonged to my mother." He dismounted, running his hand along a weathered fence post. "After the fire took my brothers and sister, we had nothing left. No home, no tools, no hope of starting over." Martha sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. This was the most he'd ever spoken of his past. There was a Ute family living. Martha's ankle throbbed as Elijah helped her into his cabin. The worn floorboards creaked beneath their combined weight, and she caught the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. He lowered her carefully onto his cot, his calloused hands gentle but impersonal. "I can manage from here," she said, arranging her skirts. "No sense in letting good food go to waste just because of a twisted ankle." Elijah's eyes flickered to his simple kitchen setup, a cast iron stove, some hanging pots, and a shelf of basic provisions. "You don't need to cook?" "Maybe not," Martha replied, already sizing up what she could reach from the cot. "But I want to. Casca needs proper meals, and so do you." For 2 days, Martha turned Elijah's sparse cabin into something closer to a home. From her seated position, she directed Casca in fetching ingredients and stirring pots. The boy moved with quiet purpose, his dark eyes bright with pride at being helpful. Even Elijah found himself drawn into their routine, wordlessly bringing in extra firewood and fresh water without being asked. They ate together at the rough-hewn table, beef and barley soup, cornbread, stewed apples from Martha's preserved stores. The meals were quiet affairs, punctuated only by the scrape of spoons and the occasional murmur of thanks, but there was a comfort in the shared silence. Martha noticed how Elijah's shoulders gradually loosened, how he stopped eating, as if he needed to hurry away. On the second evening, dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them the sharp crack of hail against the cabin's roof. Casca, who had been drawing with a piece of charcoal near the hearth, startled at a particularly loud burst of thunder. Without hesitation, he scrambled up and climbed into Elijah's lap where the man sat in his wooden chair. Elijah went rigid, his hands frozen in midair. The boy curled against his chest, shivering not from cold, but from memories of other storms, other fears. Martha held her breath, watching Elijah's face as emotions warred across it, panic, pain, and something softer trying to break through. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Elijah reached for the patchwork quilt draped over the chair's back. He wrapped it around Casca's small shoulders, his movements careful and uncertain. The boy's breathing steadied, and Elijah's hands came to rest lightly on the quilt-wrapped bundle in his lap. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something shifted like ice breaking up in spring. Elijah stared into the fire, his jaw working silently as Casca drifted to sleep against him. Martha recognized the look in his eyes, the same one she'd seen in her own mirror after losing her husband, the look of someone remembering how to hold tenderness without fear. Later that night, after Casca had been tucked into his bedroll near the hearth, Martha noticed Elijah's absence. Despite her ankle's protests, she limped to the cabin door and peered out into the rain-washed darkness. A lantern's glow spilled from the barn's open door. She found him standing in the barn's shadows, his tall frame outlined by lamplight. Two cradles sat in the corner, their wood gleaming with years of careful preservation. They were beautiful things, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines, sized for twins. Martha's heart ached at the craftsmanship, at the love worked into every detail. "They deserve to be used," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rain's drumming on the roof. Elijah's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. "They were carved for ghosts," he said roughly. His hand reached out to touch one cradle's curved edge, then fell away. "For the children my sister never had. For the family that burned while I was off trading in town." Martha stepped closer, careful to leave space between them. "And now there's a living child who needs a family, who trusts you enough to seek comfort in your arms." Elijah's breath caught audibly. He stood silent for so long that Martha thought he wouldn't respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with unshed tears. "I don't know how to be what he needs." "You already are," Martha said softly. "You gave him shelter. You held him during the storm. Sometimes that's all the knowing we need to start with." The lantern flame flickered, making shadows dance across the cradle's smooth wood. Outside, the storm began to ease, its fury gentling into a steady rain. Martha turned back toward the cabin, leaving Elijah to his thoughts, but she caught his whispered words as she left. Maybe ghosts aren't all they were carved for. The April sun warmed the earth, melting the last patches of snow into muddy rivulets. Martha stood behind the shed, her broad hands working the soil with practiced care. She had already marked out neat rows with twine, preparing the ground for the seeds she'd traded for over the winter months. Elijah moved quietly beside her, his tall frame casting long shadows across the freshly turned earth. He handed her small leather pouches filled with seeds, carrots, beans, and hardy greens that could withstand the mountain's short growing season. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man relearning an old dance. "The fence needs mending here," he said, gesturing to where winter storms had loosened several posts. "Deer'll get in otherwise." Martha nodded, watching as he gathered his tools. "Much obliged," she said softly, "though I reckon you've got better things to do than help with my little garden." Elijah paused in his work, hammer half raised. "It's good soil," he said finally. "Shame to let it go to waste." They worked through the morning, Martha planting while Elijah repaired the fence. Casca darted between them, carrying water and asking questions about each seed. The boy's presence seemed to ease something in Elijah. His shoulders relaxed, and occasionally his lips would twitch into almost smiles at Casca's earnest chatter. When afternoon came, Martha dusted off her skirts and announced they needed supplies from town. Elijah stiffened slightly but nodded. "Might as well all go," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Wagon needs loading anyway." The ride into town was quiet, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and Casca's soft humming. Martha noticed how Elijah's jaw tightened as they approached the first buildings, how his hands gripped the reins more firmly. She understood. She'd faced those stairs herself, the whispers that followed her size and heritage through town. People stopped and stared as they passed. A group of women outside the general store fell silent, their eyes wide at the sight of Martha seated beside Elijah. But no one dared say anything. Elijah's reputation for solitude and strength preceded him, creating a bubble of respectful distance. Pastor Riggs stood outside the church, his gray beard catching the sunlight. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as they approached. "Brother Storm," he called out, "and Sister Martha, what a fine day the Lord has blessed us with." Elijah helped Martha down from the wagon, his strong hands steady and sure. The pastor approached them, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I've been holding on to this," he said, unwrapping an old leather-bound Bible. Its cover was worn smooth with age and use, the pages gilt-edged and well-thumbed. "Belonged to my father before me. Been waiting for the right person to pass it along to." Martha watched as Elijah stared at the book, his face a mask of complex emotions. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it, then pulled back. "I ain't worthy of such a gift, Pastor." "None of us are worthy of God's grace," Pastor Rigg replied gently. "That's what makes it grace." He pressed the Bible into Elijah's hands. "Take it, son. It's time." Elijah's fingers closed around the leather binding. "Reckon I forgot how to pray," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "The Lord hasn't forgotten how to listen," Pastor Rigg said simply. They loaded their supplies in silence: flour, coffee, nails, and thread. Martha noticed how Elijah placed the Bible carefully on top, as if afraid it might disappear. As they headed home, the afternoon sun painting the mountain peaks in gold, Martha gathered her courage. "Did you ever think about starting again?" she asked softly. "With faith, I mean." Elijah was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years of grief. "I did once, but I buried it with my sister." He glanced at her, then back to the trail. "Seemed wrong to ask God for anything after that." Martha nodded, understanding in her bones the kind of loss that made prayer feel impossible. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "faith comes back like spring grass. Not all at once, but little by little, when we least expect it." The wagon creaked on, carrying them home through the lengthening shadows. The Bible sat between them, its presence both a promise and a question, while behind them, the town's stairs faded into the gathering dusk. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines when Martha heard the distant jingle of bridle bells. She looked up from her garden work to see Jimmy Fletcher, the mail carrier's boy, riding toward the cabin on his spotted pony. His approach was unusual. Mail rarely came this far up the mountain unless specifically requested. "Got a letter for Mr. Storm," Jimmy called out, waving a cream-colored envelope. "Been trying to get it up here for weeks, but the spring floods made the lower trail impossible." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to meet him. The boy handed down the letter, its edges worn from travel. The return address showed Denver Territory in neat, official handwriting. "Much obliged, Jimmy," she said, pressing a fresh biscuit into his hand. The boy tipped his hat and turned his pony back toward town. Martha found Elijah by the creek, checking his fishing lines. She held out the letter. "From Denver," she said softly. "Looks important." Elijah's face darkened as he took the envelope, his fingers leaving smudges on its surface. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside, his eyes scanning the words quickly. With each line, his jaw tightened and a muscle began to twitch in his cheek. "No," he growled, crushing the paper in his fist. "No, they ain't got the right." "What is it?" Martha asked, her heart beginning to pound. Instead of answering, Elijah strode to the cabin's front step. He pulled out his tinderbox, struck a match, and set the crumpled letter ablaze. The paper curled and blackened as he dropped it onto the dirt. "Elijah," Martha pressed, "tell me what's wrong." "My half-brother," he spat the words like poison, "working for the railroad now, says they're buying up land all through the territory." His voice cracked. "Says he's already signed over my claim to them. The Continental Pacific Railroad Company owns this mountain now." Before Martha could respond, Elijah grabbed his axe from beside the door and stalked into the woods. She watched him go, her heart aching at the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched around the axe handle. Casca appeared beside her, his dark eyes worried. "Is Elijah leaving?" he asked in a small voice. Martha squeezed his shoulder. "No, little one. He's just angry right now. Sometimes people need space when they're hurting." Throughout the afternoon, they heard the rhythmic thunk of Elijah's axe echoing through the trees. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, Martha knew she had to go to him. She found him in a clearing surrounded by split logs and wood chips. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were raw from hours of work. The axe rose and fell mechanically, as if he couldn't stop the motion even if he wanted to. "Elijah," she called softly. The axe bit deep into a log, and he left it there, hanging his head. "Leave me be, Martha." "No." She stepped closer, crunching over wood chips. "You need to fight this, not run from it." He yanked the axe free with savage force. "Fight?" He laughed bitterly. "Everything I ever loved burns or gets sold. First the fire took my family, now the railroad takes my land. Ain't nothing left to fight for." "Then stop hiding." Martha's voice shook with emotion, but she held her ground. "Build something they can't take from you." Elijah turned to face her, his eyes wild with grief and rage. "Like what? A family? A home? Those things ain't meant for me, Martha. I'm cursed. Everything I touch turns to ash." "That's fear talking," Martha said firmly. "And fear ain't worthy of you, Elijah Storm." She gestured back toward the cabin. "That boy up there looks at you like you hung the moon. I've watched you tend this land like it was sacred. You've got more to lose now because you've let yourself care again." Elijah's hands trembled on the axe handle. "I can't," he started, then stopped, his voice breaking. "I can't lose another home." Martha stepped forward and laid her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Then we'll fight for it, together. But you have to choose hope, Elijah. You have to believe there's something worth saving." The axe slipped from his fingers, thudding into the soft earth. In the gathering dusk, Martha could see tears tracking down his dust-streaked face. He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she'd arrived on his doorstep that snowy March day. "I don't know how," he whispered. "We'll figure it out," Martha promised. "But first, you need to come home. Casca's worried sick about you, and there's stew getting cold on the stove." Elijah nodded slowly, exhaustion replacing the fury in his features. He retrieved his axe, and together they walked back toward the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows, and Casca waited anxiously on the porch. For 3 days, Martha watched the tree line. She kept busy, tending the garden, mending clothes, teaching Casca his letters. But her eyes constantly drifted to the forest's edge. Elijah's bedroll and rifle were missing, along with his winter coat. No note, no word of where he'd gone. "He'll come back," she told Casca each night as they sat by the fire, but doubt gnawed at her heart. The boy's silent nods showed he shared her fear. On the third evening, as Martha stirred a pot of beans, Casca's voice cut through the quiet. "Look!" He pointed through the window toward the edge of the clearing. A gray wolf limped into view, its fur matted with blood. Behind it, stumbling through the deepening shadows, came Elijah. His coat was torn, his face scratched and weathered. He carried no rifle. Martha rushed outside, wrapping her shawl against the spring chill. Elijah stormed. "Where on God's earth?" "The wolf," he interrupted, his voice hoarse. "Been tracking it 3 days. Found it caught in an old trap. Tried to end its suffering, but..." He swayed on his feet. "Couldn't bring myself to do it." The wolf collapsed near the woodpile, its yellow eyes fixed on them. Up close, Martha could see the rusty trap marks on its leg, the way its ribs showed through its coat. "Inside," Martha ordered, taking Elijah's arm. "Casca, fetch my medicine bag from the shed." Elijah tried to protest. The wolf can wait 5 minutes while I look at those cuts." Martha's tone brooked no argument. She steered him toward the cabin door, noting how he leaned on her despite his stubbornness. Inside, under the lamplight, she could see the full extent of his injuries. Deep scratches ran down his face and neck. His hands were raw from cold and rope burns. A long gash on his arm had soaked his sleeve with blood. "You're lucky these aren't worse," she muttered, cleaning the wounds with whiskey and herbs. "What were you thinking? Disappearing like that? No word? No nothing?" Elijah winced as she dabbed at a particularly deep cut. Needed to think. Saw the wolf's tracks. Followed them. For 3 days? Martha's hands were gentle despite her sharp tone. "You got people who worry now, Elijah. People who care if you come home at night." He fell silent as she wrapped his arm in clean linen. Outside, they could hear Casca speaking softly to the wounded wolf in his native tongue. "I ain't used to that," Elijah finally said, so quiet she almost missed it. "Ain't used to anyone waiting up for me. Not since..." He trailed off, but Martha waited. Sometimes silence drew out truth better than questions. "It was harvest time," he continued, staring at the floor. "Ma was in town. Pa had me working the forge. I was 15, already apprenticing. My sisters were sleeping upstairs in the loft. Brother was sick with fever." Martha's hands stilled on the bandage, but she didn't interrupt. "The forge fire caught something, never knew what. Spread so fast." His voice cracked. "I got to the stairs, but the roof was already falling. Could hear them screaming. I tried, God knows I tried, but the beams..." He closed his eyes, lost in the memory. By the time help came, it was too late. Just me and the ruins. Martha finished tying off the bandage, then took his calloused hand in both of hers. "That's why you left blacksmithing." He nodded. "Couldn't bear the sight of fire. Couldn't trust my hands not to bring more death. Figured God spared me just to punish me. Watching everyone else burn while I lived." "No." Martha's voice was firm. "God didn't spare you because you're worthless. He spared you because you're still needed." Elijah looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I see it every day," she said softly. "In how you make sure Casca's blankets are warm. In how you fixed the leak in my shed roof without being asked. In how you tracked a wounded wolf for 3 days because you couldn't bear its suffering." She squeezed his hand. "That ain't the mark of a cursed man, Elijah. That's the mark of a man with too much love to contain." A tear slipped down his cheek, cutting through the dirt and dried blood. Martha reached up and wiped it away with her thumb. "I don't know how to stop being afraid," he whispered. "You don't have to know right now," she answered. "Just know you ain't alone anymore." From outside came the sound of Casca's voice, still talking to the wolf, Elijah's hand tightened around Martha's. "Reckon we should tend to that wolf," he said roughly, using his free hand to wipe his face. Martha nodded, but didn't let go of his hand just yet. "Together," she said. For the first time in 3 days, Elijah's lips curved in a slight smile. "Together?" he agreed. Pastor Riggs' study smelled of leather bindings and wood smoke. Afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating stacks of church records and territorial documents spread across his desk. Martha sat beside him, her fingers tracing faded lines of text while he adjusted his spectacles. "There must be something," Martha murmured, turning another brittle page. Her eyes were tired from hours of searching through old deeds and agreements. The railroad can't just take land that's already been granted. The pastor nodded, his gray beard catching the sunlight. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Martha. Sometimes the answer we seek has been waiting all along." He pulled another leather-bound volume from the shelf. "These are the original church records from when this territory was first settled." Outside, they could hear Casca playing in the churchyard. The boy had come with them, but the stuffiness of the study had soon driven him to seek fresh air. Through the window, Martha watched him drawing in the dirt with a stick. "Here," Pastor Riggs said suddenly, his finger marking a spot on a yellowed page. "Look at this entry from 1843. It mentions Elijah's mother by name, Sarah Storm. She received her homestead through a special agreement with the Ute tribe." Martha leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. "What kind of agreement?" "A mercy grant," the pastor explained, his voice warming with interest. "The Ute chief at the time, seeing she was a widow with young children, gave her permission to settle that particular piece of land. It was officially recorded both in tribal documents and territorial papers." Martha's heart quickened. Would that override the railroad's claim? It might. Pastor Rigg carefully turned another page. These old tribal agreements often carried more weight than people realize. The territory had to honor them to keep peace with the Ute Nation. They worked through the afternoon, piecing together the history of Elijah's land. As the sun began to set, Casca came inside, clutching a piece of paper. He tugged at Martha's sleeve, offering her his drawing. Martha took it, smiling at the careful details: mountains rising behind Elijah's cabin, sheep grazing in the meadow, every feature of the land captured through a child's eyes. Then, something clicked in her memory. "Pastor," she said urgently, "the Ute neighbor who signed the original agreement, would it have been in English?" The pastor frowned, thinking, "No, most likely not. The Ute leaders of that time used their traditional pictographs for official marks." "Like this?" Casca pointed to his drawing, then made a gesture Martha had seen him use before when speaking of his grandfather. Martha's eyes widened. That's it. The agreement would have a pictograph signature, not an English one. The railroad's lawyers might not even recognize it as legal. Pastor Riggs straightened in his chair. "There's an old agency clerk, Samuel Whitaker, who served near the Ute border for decades. If anyone would remember those treaty markings, it would be him." "Can we reach him?" "He's retired now, lives about 60 miles south." The pastor was already reaching for fresh paper. "I'll send word by the next writer. It'll take about a week to get a reply, but if he can confirm the marking..." "We might have a chance," Martha finished, hope rising in her chest. She squeezed Casca's shoulder, grateful for the boy's drawing that had sparked her memory. They rode back to Elijah's land as the sun set, Martha's saddlebags full of copied documents. The spring evening was cool, stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky. When they arrived, they found Elijah in his workshop behind the cabin. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the small space. Elijah looked up as they entered, setting aside the ladle he'd been carving. Martha recognized the wood, cherry, from the old tree that had fallen in the last storm. "Found something that might help?" she told him, laying out the documents they'd discovered. She explained about his mother's agreement, the pictograph signature, the message they'd sent to the former clerk. Elijah listened silently, his hands still on the half-finished ladle. When she finished, he picked up the carving and held it out to her. "Been working on this," he said quietly. "Figured you could use it for your stews." Martha took the ladle, running her fingers over the smooth handle. The bowl was deep and perfectly shaped, the wood grain highlighted by his careful work. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Ain't much," he mumbled, looking down. "I'll fetch something from the shed," she said, understanding his need for space to process the news. She returned with a fresh loaf of cornbread, still warm from her morning baking. They shared the bread in comfortable silence, watching through the workshop door as Casca chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. The wait for news would be long, but for now, this moment was enough. The taste of warm bread, the smell of wood shavings, and the quiet hope of a future worth fighting for. The morning sun painted the whitewashed church walls with golden light as Martha smoothed her best dress, watching the congregation file in through the double doors. Her heart skipped when she spotted Elijah's tall figure approaching from the dusty road, wearing a freshly pressed shirt and his least worn trousers. Casca, standing beside her in his Sunday clothes, tugged at her sleeve and pointed. Martha squeezed his hand, hardly believing her eyes. In all her months at the homestead, Elijah had never joined them for worship. Whispers rippled through the gathered townspeople as Elijah's boots clicked against the wooden steps. Some folks quickly looked away, while others stared openly. Martha lifted her chin, ready to shield him from judgment, but Elijah's face remained calm. He stopped beside them, nodding once. "Reckon it's time," he said quietly. Inside, the familiar scents of beeswax candles and old hymnals filled the air. Martha led them to her usual pew, third row from the back. Elijah's large frame made the wooden bench creak as he sat, Casca settling between them like a bridge connecting their worlds. Pastor Riggs' weathered face broke into a warm smile when he saw them. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows cast colorful shadows across his pulpit as he opened his Bible. "Today's message," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church, "is about the courage to open our hearts when fear would have us close them." Martha felt Elijah stiffen beside her. The pastor's words seemed chosen specially for him, though she knew the sermon had been prepared days ago. Throughout the service, she watched Elijah from the corner of her eye. His large hands remained clasped in his lap, his eyes fixed forward, but she noticed how he mouthed the words to hymns he must have learned long ago. The congregation's singing filled the church with harmony, and even Casca hummed along, though he didn't know the words. When they stood for the final hymn, Elijah's deep voice joined in, barely above a whisper but steady and true. After the service, people lingered on the church steps as they always did, sharing news and fellowship. Several nodded to Elijah, and old Mrs. Peterson even approached to say she remembered his mother's fine garden. Elijah responded with quiet courtesy, his hand resting protectively on Casca's shoulder. The afternoon sun was warm as they walked home, casting long shadows across the trail. Casca ran ahead, chasing a butterfly, while Martha and Elijah walked in comfortable silence. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming wildflowers and fresh grass. At the cabin, Elijah paused. "Wait here," he said, before disappearing around back to the barn. Martha stood on the porch, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of meadowlarks. When she heard the scrape of wood against wood, she turned to see Elijah emerging from the barn, carrying one of the old cradles. The cradle was beautiful, its cherry wood polished by years of careful storage. Delicate carvings of leaves and vines wrapped around its edges, testament to Elijah's skill with his tools. Martha's breath caught in her throat as he carried it through the cabin door. Inside, Elijah set the cradle near the hearth, where the afternoon light caught the rich wood grain. His hands lingered on the smooth rail as he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't reckon it should stay empty anymore." He kept his eyes on the cradle. Been saving these too long, waiting for something that might never come. Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks as she crossed the room to stand beside him. The cradle rocked gently at her touch, its runners moving smoothly despite the years. "Even if we don't get sons," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you've already given us a home." She reached for his calloused hand, twining her fingers with his. "You've given Casca a father's love, whether you meant to or not." Elijah turned to her then, his eyes soft with an emotion she'd never seen there before. Slowly, carefully, as if asking permission with every movement, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, and Martha closed her eyes against fresh tears. Casca chose that moment to burst through the door, freezing when he saw them. His eyes went wide at the sight of the cradle, and he approached it slowly, running his small fingers along the carved vines. "For family," he said in his quiet way, looking up at them with hope in his dark eyes. "Yes," Elijah answered, his voice stronger now. "For family." Martha watched as Casca explored the cradle, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The afternoon light streamed through the cabin windows, warming the scene with golden hope. Here they stood, the lonely widow, the grieving mountain man, and the orphaned boy, becoming something new together, something whole. The cradle rocked gently between them, no longer a reminder of loss, but a promise of tomorrow. Whatever news the writer might bring about their land, Martha knew that this moment marked a deeper victory. The day Elijah Storm finally opened his heart to love again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elijah's cabin floor when hoofbeats echoed from the trail. Martha looked up from her mending, and Elijah set down his coffee cup with a quiet clink. They'd been waiting days for word from the agency clerk, tension building with each passing hour. Through the window, they watched a dust-covered rider dismount. His horse's flanks were dark with sweat, suggesting he'd pushed hard to deliver his message. Elijah rose slowly from his chair, his shoulders tight with anticipation. Martha followed him onto the porch where Casca sat whittling a small piece of pine. The boy's hands stilled as the rider approached, pulling a leather document pouch from his saddlebag. "Mr. Storm?" The rider wiped his brow with a bandana. "Got your reply from the agency clerk. Rode straight through from Fort Collins to deliver it." Elijah took the pouch with steady hands, though Martha could see the muscle working in his jaw. He pulled out a thick envelope, broke the seal, and unfolded several pages of cramped handwriting. Martha held her breath as his eyes moved across the paper. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the pines and the stamp of the rider's horse, eager for rest. "What does it say?" Martha finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah's face was unreadable as he looked up. "The land transfer would be valid," he said slowly, "if we can prove direct connection to the Ute family that signed the original agreement." Martha's heart sank. How could they possibly trace a connection to a Ute family from decades ago? She reached for Elijah's arm, steadying herself against the wave of disappointment. But then Casca's quiet voice broke the heavy silence. "My grandfather's name was Toma," he said, setting down his whittling. "He made that mark." The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Martha's hand tightened on Elijah's arm as they both turned to stare at the boy. "What did you say?" Elijah asked, his voice rough with disbelief. Casca stood up, his small frame straight and dignified. Grandfather Toma told stories of helping a white family after fire took their children. He made his mark on paper so they could keep their land. His dark eyes met Elijah's. He said it was good medicine to help those who grieve. Martha's legs felt weak. She sank onto the porch step, mind spinning with the magnitude of what Casca had just revealed. All this time, the key to saving their land had been sitting at their table, sharing their meals, becoming part of their family. Elijah knelt before Casca, the papers trembling slightly in his large hands. "You're certain about this? Your grandfather was Toma?" Casca nodded solemnly. "He showed me his mark before he died, like this." The boy bent down and drew in the dust with his finger, a distinctive symbol that matched the one on the old document Elijah held. The rider, who had been standing quietly by his horse, cleared his throat. "That's mighty interesting, but you'll need official proof to satisfy the railroad company's lawyers. Family stories won't hold up in court." "The agency must have records," Martha said, finding her voice. "If Toma made his mark on official documents, there must be a way to trace Casca's lineage." Elijah stood slowly, looking at the boy with new eyes. Martha could see the emotions warring on his face, hope battling with the fear of hoping too much. "We'll need to speak with the Indian agent," he said finally. "Get sworn statements about Casca's family line." He turned to the writer. "Tell Pastor Rigg we'll need his help with the paperwork, and we'll pay extra if you can carry messages to the agency for us." The writer nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Much obliged, Mr. Storm. I'll head to town now and come back tomorrow for any letters you need delivered." As the rider mounted up and turned his horse toward town, Martha watched Casca. The boy had returned to his whittling, but his movements were precise and purposeful now, as if he understood the weight of what he'd just revealed. "Did you know?" she asked softly. "When we first came here, did you know this was your grandfather's land?" Casca shook his head. "Not until I saw the mountains. Grandfather described them in his stories, the 3 peaks like eagle feathers." He pointed to the distinctive ridge visible from the cabin. "Then I remembered." Elijah sat heavily on the porch step beside Martha. "All this time," he murmured, "the answer was right here." Martha reached for his hand, and for once he didn't pull away. "God works in mysterious ways," she said. "He brought Casca to us for more reasons than we knew." Casca set down his whittling and moved to stand before them. With the setting sun behind him, his shadow stretched long across the porch boards. "Grandfather said land remembers families," he said with quiet certainty. "The mountains knew I belonged here." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the simple wisdom in his words. She opened her arms, and Casca stepped into them, allowing her to hold him close. Over his head, she met Elijah's gaze, and saw in his eyes the same mix of wonder and gratitude that filled her heart. The sun sank lower behind the mountains, Toma's mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The land that had brought them together now held the key to keeping them there, bound by bonds stronger than paper and marks, stronger even than blood. The wagon creaked and swayed as they made their way south toward Conejos, following the rutted trail through patches of melting snow. Martha pulled her shawl tighter against the biting wind, grateful for the buffalo robe Elijah had wrapped around her and Casca before they'd set out at dawn. 3 days on the trail had left them weary, but determination kept them moving forward. Elijah handled the reins with careful attention, guiding the horses around muddy spots where spring thaw had softened the earth. Every few miles, he'd glance back at Martha and Casca, his eyes carrying a mix of worry and hope. "How much further?" Casca asked, his voice muffled by the wool scarf Martha had insisted he wear. "Should see the agency buildings round the next bend," Elijah answered, squinting at the horizon where gray clouds threatened more snow. Martha's heart quickened as they rounded the curve. There, nestled in a valley between snow-dusted hills, stood the weathered buildings of the Indian Agency. Smoke rose from several chimneys, promising warmth after their long journey. They pulled up to the hitching post outside the main office. Elijah jumped down first, his boots squelching in the mud, and helped Martha descend. Her legs felt stiff from the long ride, but she straightened her skirts with dignity. This moment was too important for weakness. Inside the agency office, a pot-bellied stove radiated blessed heat. The clerk, A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from his desk with mild surprise. "Can I help you folks?" "We're here about the Toma land grant," Elijah said, removing his hat. "Got word you might remember the original marking." The clerk's eyebrows rose with recognition. Ah, the Storm property case. He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Yes, I remember that mark clear as day. Toma was one of the few who used the eagle feather symbol." He peered at Casca. "This the boy you mentioned in your letter?" Before anyone could answer, a soft voice spoke from the doorway. "That is Toma's blood." An elderly Ute woman stood there, her silver hair braided neatly, her dark eyes sharp with wisdom. "I see his father in his face?" Casca straightened, recognition flooding his features. "Grandmother Spider Woman," he whispered in Ute, then moved to take her weathered hands in his. The woman smiled, touching Casca's cheek. "I knew your grandfather well," she said in careful English. "I was there when he made his mark for the Pale Eyes family." She looked at Elijah. "He spoke often of the young one who survived the fire?" Martha watched tears gather in Elijah's eyes, though he blinked them back quickly. The clerk cleared his throat, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "Well then, let's make this official." He dipped his pen in ink. "With Spider Woman's testimony and my own memory of the mark, we can certify Casca's connection to Toma." He began writing in his precise hand. "The treaty terms are quite clear. Land rights pass through blood connection." For the next hour, they worked through the necessary paperwork. Spider Woman's testimony was recorded, with Casca translating some of her more complex statements. The clerk added his own sworn statement about witnessing Toma's original mark and its meaning. As he finished the final document, the clerk looked up seriously. "This should hold up legally, but I must warn you, the railroad company won't give up easily. They've got money and lawyers, and they're used to getting their way." "Let them try," Martha said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "This land belongs to family now." The clerk smiled slightly as he stamped the papers. "Yes, ma'am, I believe it does." Outside, the threatening clouds had made good on their promise, dropping wet snow that melted as soon as it hit the ground. They said their goodbyes to Spider Woman, who pressed a small medicine pouch into Casca's hands and whispered something that made him smile. The journey home seemed shorter somehow, despite the worsening weather. They took shelter in an abandoned line shack the first night, and Martha watched as Elijah taught Casca how to build a proper fire. The second day brought clearer skies, and they made good time along the muddy trail. As sunset painted the sky on their final evening of travel, the familiar peaks of home came into view. Elijah slowed the wagon, letting the horses pick their way carefully down the last stretch of trail. Martha sat beside him on the wagon seat, Casca dozing against her shoulder. Without warning, Elijah's rough hand covered hers where it rested on the seat. His touch was warm, certain, nothing like his earlier hesitations. Martha looked up, surprised, to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart flutter. "Marrying you may have been the wisest thing I ever done," he said softly, his voice carrying all the weight of a vow. Martha's throat tightened with emotion. She turned her hand over to lace her fingers through his, and together they guided the wagon home, where two cradles and countless possibilities waited. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Elijah carefully folded the clerk's affidavit into an envelope. His hands, usually so steady at forge work, trembled slightly as he sealed it. Martha watched from the doorway, her heart full as he pressed his mother's old seal into the warm wax. "God willing, it'll reach the county seat by week's end," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. The days that followed stretched like molasses, but finally a rider appeared on the horizon. Martha was in the garden when she heard the horse's hooves. She dropped her trowel and hurried to where Elijah already stood, reading the official response with intense concentration. "The land stays ours," he said simply, but his eyes shone. Railroads got no claim here. That Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Martha smoothed her best dress, watching as Elijah put on his rarely worn suit coat. Together, they walked into the small church with Casca between them. The usual whispers fell silent as Elijah, instead of taking his customary place at the back, led them to a pew near the front. When prayer time came, Elijah did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He knelt. Martha felt tears spring to her eyes as he lowered himself beside her, his large hand finding hers as they bowed their heads. The congregation's collective intake of breath was audible, followed by a reverent silence. That evening, Martha sat at their small table while Elijah moved about the kitchen, preparing a simple supper of beans and cornbread. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man working up courage. Finally, he set down the plates and sat across from her. "Been thinking," he said slowly, staring into his tin cup, "about them cradles, about being a father?" He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Not because I ought to be, because I want to be." Martha's heart skipped. She'd been counting days, wondering how to tell him. "Elijah," she said softly, "I'm late, by about a week." The tin cup slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table. Coffee splashed across the wooden surface, but neither of them moved to wipe it up. They stared at each other, shock melting into joy, until suddenly they were both laughing and crying at once. Elijah reached across the table, taking her hands in his. His fingers were calloused but gentle, and his eyes held a light she'd never seen before. The June sunshine warmed the cabin's weathered logs as wildflowers dotted the meadow in splashes of purple and gold. Martha sat in her rocking chair on the porch, her hands resting on her swollen belly, watching Casca and Pastor Rigg beneath the old oak tree. The boy's voice carried clearly as he carefully recited from Matthew. "That's right, son," Pastor Rigg encouraged, his gray beard catching the afternoon light. "Now, what does that verse mean to you?" Inside the workshop, the steady rhythm of Elijah's carving tools filled the air. His deep voice hummed an old hymn, something he'd started doing more and more lately. Martha smiled, remembering how silence used to reign over this place. The scent of baking bread and stewed chicken drew their neighbors up the path as evening approached. Martha had insisted on hosting, despite being 8 months along. "A home needs sharing," she'd said, and Elijah hadn't argued. Their small table groaned under the weight of dishes brought by helping hands. Widow Jensen brought her famous apple pie, while the Coopers arrived with fresh churned butter. Even Tom from the general store made the trek up, carrying a bag of hard candies for Casca. As they gathered around the table, Widow Jensen dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Lord above," she whispered, touching Martha's arm, "you've brought such warmth back to this place. Used to be so dark and lonely up here." Martha caught Elijah's eye across the table. His face softened as he nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. Later, after their guests had gone and Casca was asleep in his room, Elijah and Martha sat before the crackling fire. He pulled her close, his hand finding its familiar place on her belly. "Been thinking," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I said I wanted sons back when you first came, but having you and Casca..." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I don't need sons to feel whole anymore. This family, it's already more than I deserved." Martha leaned into him, feeling the baby kick against her ribs. "But if he blesses us with boys?" she prompted gently. Elijah's hand tightened slightly on hers. "Then I'll name them after James and William, the brothers I lost. Give their names new life, new hope." The fire popped and sparked, casting warm light on the freshly carved cradle in the corner. Martha watched the shadows dance across its smooth surface, feeling the perfect peace of the moment settle over their home like a blessing. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, It might be just what you needed to hear.